Speaker, I'm asking your indulgence today on me making a few remarks to a point of order that Senator Down raised on March 30th when he raised a point of order about there being some inflammatory language being used in the Senate. And the reason I'm doing this today, Mr. Speaker, is it referenced comments that were made by, or he at least suggested later, it was about comments that Senator Housakos and I had made during question period. We were, of course, the first two up in question period, and by the time question period was done and Senator Down made the motion, we did not get up to debate this. So I am asking today, Mr. Speaker, for your indulgence for me and possibly other senators that would like to make a few comments in relation to this charge.
Well, thank you for your comments, Senator Plett. It's unusual that once we have had a point of order raised, and I've asked others if they want to comment, to open it up again. However, it's not something that I haven't done in the past, and I am prepared to do it again, but I would remind anybody who wants to participate that we're referring to Rule 6-13 sub 1, which pertains to personal, sharp, or taxing unparliamentary language, and I would ask you to confine your comments to that particular section, and please be as brief as you possibly can. Senator Plett.
Thank you, Speaker, and I will, I like the word brief as you possibly can, and I will try to do that, Mr. Speaker, but in speaking to this particular issue and in reference to comments we made that were pertaining to the Prime Minister, in order for me to do justice, I at least need to list a number of illustrations to defend my position. But I will try to move along, Mr. Speaker, and I will try to move along, Mr. Speaker. The comments that we did in fact make and that you have been asked to review question the language used when referring to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and him having lied to Canadians. To which I must point out, Mr. Speaker, when the Prime Minister is engaging in unparliamentary behavior, it is impossible to address this behavior accurately without using what is perceived as unparliamentary language in other contexts. I would argue that in this context, the language is not unparliamentary. It was neither inflammatory, nor did it attribute motives. It simply stated facts. It was not an accusation, it was an observation. And this is the crux of the matter. When the Emperor parades around the country and clearly has no clothes on, it is not unparliamentary to say so. I would argue that it is unparliamentary not to say so, or to try to prevent a parliamentarian from speaking the plain truth. If I and other senators are compelled to describe the unparliamentary behavior of our Prime Minister in a manner which does not accurately reflect his behavior, then in fact we are being asked to lie. And we are being prevented from holding this government to account as the official opposition. I do not think that is the intention of this chamber, but this is the practical outcome. The question before us today is whether the language used accurately depicts the actions of the Prime Minister. I believe it does. The Prime Minister has demonstrated a repeated habitual pattern of saying things which are proven to not be true. And I would like to take a few moments to provide clear evidence which supports this position. Allow me to begin with the definition of the verb lie by Merriam-Webster Dictionary. To make an untrue statement with intent to deceive and to create a false or misleading impression. Mr. Speaker, for further clarity, let me use the definition of dictionary.com. To speak falsely or utter untruth knowingly as with intent to deceive and to express what is false, convey a false impression. When Senator Housakos said that the Prime Minister lied, he was making reference clearly to the commitment that the Prime Minister himself made to Canadians. And allow me to refresh all of our memories of exactly what Senator Housakos said, and I quote, In 2015, this Prime Minister made a commitment to the Canadian people that he would not have a debt run longer than 2 fiscal years. And he promised that he would balance the deficit by 2019. That's what he promised. The question is a simple one. Why did he lie to the Canadian people? Unquote. Later, my colleague said, and again I quote, and yes, the Prime Minister lied. He misled Canadians when he made a commitment to balance the budget by 2019. In this town, we have to start coming up to speed with the fact when we mislead taxpayers, we have to account for what it somehow does and not double down. My colleague Senator Housakis' comments speak directly to a promise by the Prime Minister and regrettably a promise not kept. When a Prime Minister, a Cabinet Minister, and a member of the government makes a promise to Canadians, I believe the Canadians have the right to expect that the commitment be fulfilled. And if it hasn't been fulfilled, I further believe that Canadians have the right to expect that a serious opposition in the House of Commons and in the Senate has a responsibility to challenge the governing party on its inactions and failures. Mr. Speaker, the unfilled promise that Senator Housakis mentioned is just one example of many. I don't think we need to list them all, but I certainly encourage anyone interested in tracking the Prime Minister's commitments to look up the numbers on Polymeter. In his tenure of more than 2,500 days in office, Prime Minister Trudeau's government has a mediocre rate of 37% of promises kept and fulfilled. Mr. Speaker, back to my comments on March 30th. Although my comments were made in a similar fashion to my colleague, my intent was to address another angle altogether. When I referenced my question and comments, what I referenced in my question and comments was the ongoing and never-ending pattern of the Trudeau government deliberately not expressing or representing something accurately. Last fall, I and many other members of the Conservative opposition repeatedly asked questions on who stayed at the outrageous $6,000 a night hotel suite in London, paid by taxpayers. At the time, the Prime Minister refused to tell the truth to Canadians on this expense. No straight answers were given. He avoided the question. His carefully scripted response was vague in an attempt to avoid all scrutiny. And yet, Prime Minister Trudeau originally campaigned on the promise of sunny ways and more openness and accountability. Unfortunately, we soon learned that the Prime Minister's promises were only words left out in the open for him to lead on Canadians. Once in office, Prime Minister Trudeau's priority quickly switched to working really hard at preventing Canadians from learning the truth, especially on decisions that could be damaging to his own public image. But back to the question I posed on March 30th, that you, Mr. Speaker, have been asked to review. Who stayed at the luxurious $6,000 a night hotel suite for a 5-night stay at the cost of $30,000 to Canadian taxpayers? The Prime Minister's office eventually was obliged to fess up. And to no one's surprise, it was Justin Trudeau who disregarded the high cost of the luxury suite in London. This $6,000 a night suite scandal is a slap in the face of hardworking Canadians who face the worst affordability crisis in a generation. So how do we learn that it was the Prime Minister who enjoyed this luxury? There were no apologies to taxpayers for this outrageous expense. There was no come-clean moment and realization of the mistake. The Prime Minister's office sheepishly provided information to a House of Commons committee in the shadow of the U.S. President Biden's visit to Parliament Hill. This was clearly a planned attempt to get away from any public scrutiny on this outrageous expense by the Prime Minister. In hindsight, there was more truth to what the Prime Minister Trudeau said all along during his stay in London when he sang, Caught in a landslide, no escape from reality. Open your eyes, look up to the skies and see. I'm just a poor boy, I need no sympathy, because I'm easy come, easy go, little high, little low. Any way the wind blows, doesn't matter to me, to me. Nothing really matters, anyone can see. Nothing really matters. Nothing really matters to me. It seems that Prime Minister Trudeau needs to be reminded and needs to remember that it does matter. It matters because he is the current leader of our country, and that his words and actions impact Canadians. It matters because the price tag of this luxurious suite in London is on the back of hard-working Canadians. It matters because in the face of economic uncertainty, Canadians want to see a Prime Minister lead by example. And this is a far cry from what Canadians expect and deserve. The reporter who broke the $6,000 hotel suite story is Brian Lilley from the Toronto Sun. Allow me to quote from his March 30th article. The Trudeau government really didn't want this information out there, and they worked hard to stop it from being released. It was only released last week, and U.S. President Joe Biden was landing in Canada because a Commons committee had demanded the information, and the PMO had run out of legal ways to keep the information secret. Now they want to blame the RCMP, claim that they needed the expensive room for Mounties providing security to Trudeau. Brian Lilley concluded this article by saying either the Liberals are really slipping and have been off their game for months on this high-profile story, or they are lying to us now to cover this up. Let me repeat that. Or they are lying to us to cover this up.
Your historical background and your commentaries on news comments and everything are really things that I'm very much aware of and have very much at my disposal in terms of my research. I really want you to just stay to the point of the rule, which concerns personal, sharp, or taxing comments made here in the chamber. I think what you're talking about now really is not relevant to an interpretation of that rule. So if you could just veer back, and I allow some leeway in terms of commentaries, but if you could get back to how the rule is or is not offended, it would be more helpful to me in that regard. Senator Platt.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I will attempt to do that. However, if I could at least suggest this, Mr. Speaker, I made comments that were said to be unparliamentary and that I should not have made. I didn't make them out of anger. I didn't make them out of malice. I made them out of an observation that we have a Prime Minister who has a hard time telling the truth, which to me means that when somebody does not tell the truth, that person is lying. And in order for me to make my case, Mr. Speaker, I need to at least lay out some of the untruths, lies, in my opinion, that the Prime Minister has said. I will try to go through this very rapidly, Speaker, and try to draw this to a conclusion in the next minute or two. But let me at least go back to what I said on March 30th, when I said, how can that explanation be trusted when the Prime Minister has lied on numerous occasions? How can that explanation be trusted when the Prime Minister could have said from the start but chose not to do so? Isn't that misinformation? Lastly, Leader, as I said yesterday, when will Justin Trudeau realize he has lost the confidence of the Canadians? Mr. Speaker, it's important that I share the context of that with everyone in this chamber. Let me just also briefly point out what former Justice Minister and Attorney General Jody Wilson-Raybould said, and I'm skipping through a lot here, Speaker. I will wrap up. In her book entitled Indian in the Cabinet, that she was mad at herself for having once thought that the Prime Minister Trudeau is, and I quote, an honest and good person, when in truth he would so casually lie to the public and then think he could get away with it. Last week, Prime Minister Trudeau was again caught in a lie on the Trudeau Foundation when he said, and again I quote, It's in my it's a foundation in my father's name. I have no direct or indirect connection with. We heard again today how the government, yesterday, how the government appoints 2 people to the foundation, how the family appoints 2 people to the foundation, how his siblings are part of the foundation, and how for a year and a half they used marketing materials under Justin Trudeau's name. Mr. Speaker, there are so many examples of falsehoods I could go on. I will not. I will just simply close, Mr. Speaker, that even the NDP has called out the Prime Minister Trudeau's lies, and yet they continue to put their support behind him and his government. Here's what the NDP promoted on their website. Sign if you are tired of Trudeau's lies about pharmacare. Add your name to tell Justin Trudeau you're sick of his lies. Mr. Speaker, I've made my case, but let me just conclude with this comment. If it looks like a duck and it swims like a duck, Speaker, and it quacks like a duck, it is probably a duck. Senator Housakis and I are only guilty of speaking the truth by making comments, as I mentioned in my remarks, that are factual, not unparliamentary in my humble opinion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Senator Down, I will